This video is brought to you by PPLIR Europe, a not-for-profit community of European general aviation pilots dedicated to helping ourselves and others to use our licenses to the full. We share our passion for flying through mutual exchange of expertise, experience, information, inspiration, and education. We also assist regulators in framing legislation that affects all GA pilots. We're almost all volunteers and do it because we love it, though we do also need to raise a little money, mainly to fund our representation and lobby activities. Please join us, improve and broaden your own flying, enjoy belonging to a community of like-minded pilots, and help us represent you. Hi. As the introduction of the basic instrument rating in Europe gets closer, I've made this short video to help pilots thinking about getting an IFR qualification decide whether they should get a full IR or a basic IR. In the UK, the CAA have announced that the BIR will not be available, so the alternative is the IRR or IMCR, and I'll make a separate video about that. Before I embark on the differences between the ratings, a word about why you might want to have an IFR qualification at all. Some people think of it as a rating to allow you to fly in cloud or in weather below VMC minima, but there's much more to it than that. Most IFR flying takes place in VMC. If you think about flying in a commercial jet, most of the climb, all of the en route, and most of the descent is in bright, clear VMC. Typically, you might climb through a layer of clouds between about 3,000 and 8,000 feet, fly for several hours in the clear, then descend through similar conditions. An 8-hour flight will usually have less than 15 minutes in IMC. So, why is the whole flight in IFR? Well, it comes down to a number of factors. Firstly, separation from other traffic. The IFR system in controlled airspace will ensure that you never collide with other aircraft. This is far from assured flying VFR by looking out for other traffic. Secondly, terrain safety. If the IFR are followed, you'll never hit terrain or obstacles. And thirdly, ease of planning and execution. If flying IFR routes in controlled airspace, you never have to worry about airspace, danger areas, or route finding. It's all done for you in the planning and once you're in the air by controllers. Compare that to poring over charts, checking all the airspace, seeing which danger and restricted areas are active, where the parachutes are being dropped, where the flying displays are, and all the other things you need to know. As I said in my Let's Get Real video, an experienced pilot flying a familiar route can plan an IFR flight across Europe in the back of a taxi on the way to the airfield. Even the less experienced can do it much quicker and easier than for a VFR flight. This also means that you arrive fresh and unstressed. Everything just flows from your plan. Fourthly, increased certainty of dispatch and arrival. If you don't have an IFR rating, you need to be sure to be able to maintain VMC for the whole flight, which means that you're always looking at the pessimistic end of the forecast, which may be much worse than the conditions turn out to be. If your flights are all for leisure and can be cancelled at short notice with little inconvenience, that's not too much of a problem. But if you're travelling for work, or you're taking the family on holiday, going to an important event, or just have a hotel booked, it can cause difficulties. And the longer the trip, the less likely that you'll be able to be sure that you'll get VMC at both ends and throughout the flight. It's not just a matter of the weather turning out to be okay. You'll want to know a reasonable time in advance, early enough to make other arrangements, if the flight's not going to be possible, and that makes most people very cautious or conservative in their planning. So, there are quite a few different reasons for people wanting an IFR qualification, and how much emphasis you place on each of them might affect your decision as to which one to go for. Which rating you go for is going to depend on a number of things. Are you getting the rating for the comfort of operating in controlled airspace? Are you getting the rating so that you can take off and land in bad weather? The IR allows you to operate to Cat 1 ILS minima, that's 200 feet and 550 meters RVR. The BIR is limited to a minimum visibility of 1,500 meters for takeoff and landing, and a ceiling of 600 feet for takeoff, and generally a planned 600 feet for landing, though if you get there and the cloud is lower than 600 feet, you can still descend to 200 feet above the decision altitude or MDA for the approach, which might, for example, be a height of 400 feet for an ILS or LBV, and say 500 feet for a non-precision approach. Thirdly, where do you want to use the rating? The full IR allows you to fly an EASA-registered aircraft, IFR, in any airspace in any country in the world. The BIR allows you to fly in any airspace in EASA, though we don't yet know whether the UK will recognise it. Notice that most of the Balkan countries are not in EASA, so the BIR holder on the way to or from Greece, Bulgaria or Romania might have to take a big detour, and also miss out on the often low fuel prices in Serbia. So, on the face of it, the IR holder has the best of all worlds, so why doesn't everyone get an IR? The answer lies in time, effort, and cost. Starting with the theoretical knowledge exams, the requirements for the IR, though less than for a professional license, are still quite demanding. Many people, myself included, would say that you can never know too much, and anyway, learning about flying, aircraft, systems, and meteorology is fun and interesting and never wasted. But many people just don't have the time or inclination for so much study. Then, moving on to the flying, you need to show a total of 40 hours, or 45 hours on a twin. That total can be made up in a number of ways. Some can be by instrument flight experience if you have a different way of flying IMC, such as military experience or the UK IRR, and some on the simulator. But most people in Europe will find themselves paying for 40 or 45 hours of instructor plus aircraft or simulator. That's quite a burden in both time and money, so you need to be sure you want to do it. The BIR is lighter touch, a little in the TK and significantly in the training. You still need to take exams, but they're lower impact and take a little less time both to study and to sit, particularly as they've been combined into 3 instead of 7 exams. On the flying side, there's no minimum training requirement. You just have to demonstrate to an approved training organisation that you have all the competencies, and then to an examiner that you've reached the required standard. You might think that everyone needs at least 40 hours to get to that standard. But for the BIR, you can do nearly all the training either with an independent instructor on your own aircraft or even on an unapproved sim such as X-Plane. I can get someone to very close to test standards on my home sim for a comparatively tiny cost, which would only be a couple of hours on an aircraft. I can then make sure that the skills have transferred to the aircraft and send them to the ATO and examiner. It's a really low-cost solution. And then, the only disadvantage of the BIR over the IR is the 1,500 meters and 600 feet. Let's talk about how much of a problem that really is. I think there are 2 considerations here. How vital is it that you get to your destination, and what is the purpose of your flight? If you fly on business and a delayed or cancelled flight could cost you a contract, then obviously you'll want to stack all the odds in your favour. That means a full IR. But if you're travelling on leisure, and if delaying by a day or even cancelling is not going to be a big problem, you might think it's worth taking the risk of being limited to the higher minima. This is especially true if you only fly to places when the weather is nice. But bear in mind that even if you're going to a beach in the south of France or Spain, if you need to get back to Denmark, the weather may be below BIR minima. So, what are the actual risks of not being able to make the flight? Well, the PPLIR Europe community did a little ad hoc project to answer that question. We took all the METARs for 2.5 years for the whole of Europe and analysed what proportion of the time the conditions fell below VMC, the BIR planning minima, the BIR flying minima, the IR minima, both with and without an autopilot, and below Cat 1, so not accessible to the GA pilot. The link to the database is in the comments below, and you're welcome to do your own analysis for the countries and airports where you fly. I can only make some general observations. If you do use it, the column for BIR planning is labelled SVFR, which is generally the same thing. We've removed from the database the small hours of the morning from about 2300 hours to 0700 hours, as these times are not really of interest to people like us. The first point that falls out of the data is that most flights can be completed in reasonably good VFR, that is 5,000 meters visibility and 1,500 meters cloud base. As you might imagine, the numbers vary across Europe, with the South offering good VFR 90 to 99% of the time, and the Baltic 65 to 75%. Most countries fall in the 80s and low 90s of percent. Not surprisingly, the Mediterranean tops the league, and the northeastern states have the poorest results. But countries like France and Germany, in the middle of the league table, still have weather not suitable for VFR only between 15 and 20% of the time. Moving on to days when you can plan a BIR flight, that is to say that the ceiling is 600 feet or higher and the visibility at least 1,500 meters, the range is from the high 90s% in the south to the high 80s in the Baltic, with most countries in the mid-90s. So, for example, in Germany and France, you could plan a BIR flight 95% of the time. So the BIR holder has to stay on the ground about 5% of the time. Let's now compare that with the IR holder. With a full IR, you can expect to be able to land between 98 and 100% of the time. In other words, about 1 to 2% of the time you can't fly. So, is it worth all the extra time, trouble and expense to get an IR compared to the BIR? There are two ways to look at it. The BIR can operate between 90 and 97% of the time in Europe, with the most restrictive areas being the countries around the Baltic. IRs can operate between 98 and 100% of the time, with the most restrictive place being Luxembourg, and the Mediterranean and Norway the least restrictive. So you could say that having an IR only adds a few percentage points on and is not worth the trouble. But the other way round, you could think in terms of hours and days you can't operate. In Germany, for example, the BIR cannot operate around 16 days or 280 hours a year, where an IR can. The difference is larger in the Baltics again, where an IR is a real advantage, and least, not surprisingly, in the Mediterranean. So, as I said before, your decision is going to depend on how important it is to you to arrive when you want to, and also where you want to go. If you shuttle between Switzerland and Spain, there's very little advantage to an IR over a BIR. Between Poland and Denmark, the advantage is much greater. But why not play on our database and see what the figures are for your kind of flying before making your decision? I do hope that that's helpful. See you in the next video.